I thought he had bagpipes.
Don't be daft.
Welcome back everyone. D-Day stands as one of the most iconic chapters in British military history, and leading the charge were the men of the 6th Airborne Division, instantly recognisable by their famous red or technically maroon berets. In the last video we delved into how Major General Richard Gale shaped this unit from scratch, overcame the RAF's logistical roadblocks and then prepared the unit for the crucible of war against the Nazis. Today, historian Andy Wheel joins me once again to walk us through the division's pivotal role on D-Day itself. We'll examine the fighting that dragged on far longer than anyone expected and dissect the core reasons that the 6th Airborne Division achieved such success under extraordinary circumstances. Alright, buckle up, this is where all their rigorous training and innovative leadership truly get put to the test.
Okay, so this is a map, one of the maps that I had created for the book, which gives you an idea really of 6th Airborne's objectives on D-Day. If you look carefully and closely at the map, you can see the drop-in zones, the LZs, the DZs, landing zone drop-in zones, W, N, Y, X, K, and V. If you look to the right of the map, as you face it, if you look to the right of the map, you can see the River Deve. Now, the River Deve was the first river barrier, which was sort of bordering the eastern nodgement of what would become the British landing area. And the role, starting with DZV, 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, was charged with destroying bridges and also an enemy HQ around Breville, towards the top of the picture, and then down towards Rob Home as well. Pardon my French pronunciation. And then towards the bottom of the page, moving out from K, 8th Battalion would be doing a similar job near Troarn and also Burs. And this is important because by destroying the bridges over the Deve, that formed that into an outer river barrier, which would prevent German mechanised and mobile forces from using those bridges to attack the eastern flank of the British landings.
Yeah,
and then obviously to the north of V, something that your followers will be familiar with, 9th Parachute Battalion landed. They were charged with destroying the Merville Battery, which is at the top of the map, which would have fired directly onto Sword Beach. And even though it had out-of-date Czech guns, it would have been very effective. Those batteries, certainly the battery at Merville, could have fired directly onto Sword, no problem. And then moving across to N, that was the landing zone for 5th Parachute Brigade. And now you're into sort of the heart of the landing area. And 5th Parachute Brigade was going to land around and secure the divisional area at Ronville, with LZN being the main supply drop zone for 6th Airborne Division. And then obviously you've got the Dead Stick, the Ox and Bucks landing areas at X and Y around the two bridges, which everybody will be completely familiar with, I'm sure, at Benneville around the Café Gondray. Those two key bridges they had to seize over the River Orne and the Caen Canal, which are absolutely key. And then with a further drop-in zone for 6th Air Landing Division at W. Now, the whole plan had to be switched around in April, May, when it became apparent that the Germans were installing stakes. These little white dots appeared on the air reconnaissance photographs, and the Germans were installing stakes, which would have ripped up gliders if they landed. So, whereas Gale and Browning had intended for 6th Air Landing Division to land en masse to secure the two bridges, that had to be changed because obviously the gliders would have been torn to bits. So 5th Parachute Brigade was moved up, and 6th Air Landing Brigade became like the reserve brigade, effectively, that would come in at 9 p.m. on the night of D-Day after the parachute troops and parachute engineers had removed those stakes. Now, if you look round the map, if you see the little hatched round areas, that actually shows you the locations of the German forces in the immediate area on the night of D-Day. If you look to the left at Colombelles, where there were some industrial towers up to the northeast of Caen, you can see 8th Company 125 Panzer Grenadier Division. And then down to the right near Troarn, you can see 5th Company 125 Panzer Grenadier Division. There's a company of the Ost Battalion, 4th Company 642 Ost Battalion at Bavant. A further company of 125 Panzer Grenadier Division at Hérouvillette. And the largest unit, sort of a battalion scale that could have intervened directly, is up near Horga, which is the rest of 642 Ost Battalion, which had quite a large bayonet strength, although they were not terribly well motivated troops, with a slightly less issue, a slightly smaller issue of heavy weapons compared to some of the other German formations. But it's interesting. I took that information from a map that I saw at the Bundesarchive at Freiburg, and although obviously the German company strengths are high compared to what would inevitably be a scattered British parachute company, they had broken up these units into like penny packets, really, of companies. And it does throw up the question in terms of the Germans' readiness and preparation. If they'd perhaps just had one battalion of perhaps one of the Panzer Grenadier regiments of 21st Panzer Division completely concentrated and in that area where the landing zones and drop zones would have been, it could have made quite a difference on the day.
Well, that's a good point to move forward then. What did happen on the day? Do you want to talk us through how things progressed?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That photograph there, that's the platoon commanders of the Pathfinder Company, 22 Company, synchronise their watches before they take off. It's a very famous image. The parachute drops took place. Unfortunately, there was quite a lot of confusion in terms of the Rebecca Eureka sort of radio finding beacon system didn't perform quite as well as it could have done in terms of some of the frequencies have got mixed up. And also when the Pathfinders landed, one problem they had was that obviously the air reconnaissance photographs hadn't shown the growth of crops. And the Pathfinders landed and they effectively had 25 to 30 minutes in the pitch black to find their equipment, to get all these beacons set up and get the show on the road. And the growth of these crops meant that they couldn't find the equipment that had landed in the fields. That was just one of the issues they had. They also unfortunately lost their company commanding officer, Lennox Boyd, who was either hit by enemy fire or just fell out of the plane and was lost just before the landings, which is a tragedy, but kind of also an indication of some of the adapted bomber aircraft that we were having to use, which weren't adequate to the task. So then, essentially, when Free Parachute Brigade landed, it only landed with 30% to 33% of its effective strength, and all the rest of the men were scattered. 5th Parachute Brigade landed with about 60% of its strength, which is obviously a better place. Now, the British planning had anticipated perhaps 25% scattering, but the tremendous thing, and it's a tremendous testament to the training of the officers and Gale and the simplicity of his plans, because every unit basically had a destruction objective in Free Parachute Brigade, and then it was to fall back onto the line that was to be established. Even with 30% effective, they still carried out, by and large, they carried out all their tasks effectively, and they were successful. And then 5th Parachute Brigade landed and established a strong defence around the divisional HQ at Ronville. And by about 4 o'clock in the morning, Gale had a small but perfectly formed divisional HQ and knew what was going on and was getting ready for the landing, the seaborne landings that were going to come some hours later, and obviously the later landings of 6th Air Landing Brigade.
And going back to your earlier map, how closely did the operation reflect the planning?
The success was, and we'll talk a little bit about combat effectiveness in a little while, I think, but effectively they did gain, they in essence achieved all their objectives. So the plan was fulfilled, but I think the real success was at the sort of junior leadership level and the determination and also the simplicity of Gale's plan. I mean, it was, I think, a common feature of all the Allied airborne forces that landed on the night before D-Days. I think Robert Kershaw, the author, said is that quite often they succeeded in ways that they hadn't imagined, because even the scattered troops caused mayhem as far as the Germans were concerned as they were awakening to the mass landings that were taking place.
What do you think made them so effective on the day, and then also moving forward throughout the rest of the campaign? Was it just the leadership? Was it the trading? Was it their tactical doctrine? What do you think?
I think, I mean, I've interviewed, sadly, they've all passed away now, but I interviewed several veterans when I was doing my research, and they're all very, very modest. But interestingly, I spoke to Nick Archdale, who was the mortar platoon commander of 7th Parachute Battalion, and I asked him, I said, did you at any point think that you wouldn't succeed? And he said, oh, absolutely not. I said, we always knew we were going to succeed. But I think they had a simple plan. They'd been effectively trained. I think they knew what to expect. And I think the low-level leadership, the message had been trained through from Gale. And I think they were... I think he got them into a place where they were up for a fight. I mean, you could make the point that they had nowhere to go because they'd landed in the middle of the night and the Germans were there and they had to fight them or die, really. But I think it was a combination of all simple training, simple plan, motivation, esprit de corps. I spoke to another veteran, Tony Lycett, and I asked him about what he thought about like the maroon beret and the badges, and he'd been recruited from essentially from the King's Dragoon Guards, where he's training to be a tank crewman, and he decided wasn't really into that, and he wanted to join airborne forces. And I said, did it make a difference, the change in uniform? And with some reverence, he went and opened this box to show me his airborne badges and the beret. And I think it just all came together, really. I think they were just determined. I think they had an identity. I mean, it's all the characteristics, all the things that you want in effective fighting forces.
And I think there was a bit of a surprise, wasn't there, in that they then ended up staying right at the tip of the spear for the rest of the campaign. Essentially, that wasn't originally part of the plan, was it?
Not really. As operations developed to the south, and all the big operations like the push around Caen and the push into the Odon Valley, so they were left there. But what was quite interesting, and something I discovered, which then reflects kind of forward on his post-war campaign, is that while 6th Airborne Division and Gale were in First Corps, which was part of the Canadians, they were defending this eastern side of the lodgement. But what came under Gale's command, Gale ended up commanding 2 commando brigades, the Belgian Infantry Brigade and the Princess Irene Dutch Brigade. So almost in a way, Gale had kind of this mini corps. It didn't have a great deal of mobility, but it was quite important, just completely stabilising and just stymieing any German efforts on the eastern flank. And there they were, and they had taken losses. They got replacements. They got replacements from some of the light infantry battalions back in the UK, many of whom stayed and would go back to do the parachute training and then rejoin them again, which is a good reflection on the esprit de corps of the division and those airborne battalions.
And it must have been quite tough for Gale and the other senior commanders then, to maintain command and control with such a diverse group of soldiers under them from different nations, different methodologies, different tactical doctrines, I should think. So it must speak volumes for their skill to manage all of these different nationalities and types of soldiers.
I think it's a reflection of Gale, and I think there was camaraderie. He developed a divisional newspaper called Pegasus, and he made everybody sort of involved in that. And there was sort of like little jokes between the commandos and the airborne forces. That there was one joke that went into the magazine where they said that in the commando brigade perimeter, kangaroos had been spotted. And the joke was that the Marines, the commandos, Army and Royal Marine Commandos, they dug their slit trenches so deep that kangaroos had come through from Australia. So it was all very inclusive, the sort of camaraderie. You kind of get the feeling, obviously there was rivalry, but I think Gale, the further up you went in the chain of command, the more inclusive it all sort of was.
And then, sir, you've obviously analysed the entire campaign in great detail. How did you go about measuring the success of 6th Airborne Division? What was your methodology, and what have been your conclusions?
There's a diagram to look at in a short while. About a lot of it was based on Gale and the ethos and the sort of spirit that he generated. But I mean, there are some themes that come through which I sort of found in my research. Innovation was a very important theme. Jack Norris, who's the artillery commander for the division, they had an artillery regiment that was led by Tony Teacher, but Norris realised that the key artillery firepower strength would be co-opting the conventional field and medium and heavy regiments of surrounding sort of conventional infantry and armoured division forces around them, and they became very adept at that. So that innovation was good, and then also battle grouping. If you actually look at Operation Dead Stick, the focus popularly is on the Oxen Bucks capturing the bridges, but that expanded company that John Howard had was actually attached to 7 Para, and it was their operation. So there was a coup de main party of glider troops attached to a reinforcing parachute battalion, and if all those guys had landed and and if the parachute battalion had taken 25% scattering losses, it still would have been a very formidable force. And 7 Parachute Battalion had done quite a lot of training on mending and actually rebuilding bridges, and they actually took quite a lot of rope and bits of timber into operation with them that they dropped, that were dropped with them. So it's battle grouping, innovation, leadership, training. These are the things that made the 6th Airborne Division successful, and then that carried on. And in a minute or two, the map that was up a moment ago, we'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Breville and the sort of the situation. That's that map, yeah, which is a bit mad. But it gives you an idea of what they were up against and what was going on the 12th of June, around between the 10th, 11th, 12th of June, when German reinforcements had really arrived. We were arriving in strength all around that perimeter. So if we talk through that map now, essentially you've got a situation where 1st Special Service Brigade, the commandos, that's coming to the line at the top around Horga and Salonels. There's still elements of the German 642 Ost Battalion around the bridge at Frankville. And the Germans have actually moved back over onto the Merville battery site. And then the key thing that's going on is the 346 German Infantry Division, which had been based around Le Havre, had come into the line with its Grenadier regiments. And you can see those there, 857 Grenadier Regiment and 858 Grenadier Regiment. And they were attacking, and they'd been reinforced with elements of the 711 German Infantry Division, and obviously also 21st Panzer Division was still in play at the bottom of the page, with continued attacks by Hans von Luck's 125 Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which had all sorts of, a lot of their vehicles were captured French vehicles, but they were quite formidable. They'd been up-armoured, and there was a tremendous amount of firepower in terms of mortars and machine guns. And Gale, as part of his plan, if you see that hatched area, that was what he referred to as the tank killing ground, which has taken advantage of the anti-aircraft 6-pounder anti-tank guns that the Air Landing Brigade had, which you can see strung across there. 1st Royal Ulster Rifles, 12 Devons and 2 Oxen Bucks. And it was deliberate to try and break up those mechanised attacks. But essentially, by the 10th of June, there was tremendous pressure coming under the Chateau St. Con position, where 9 Para was coming under tremendous pressure from German attacks and reinforcements. And at one point, it could only be fixed by Hill going forward with 60 Canadians personally to drive the Germans back. The reinforcement by 51st Highland Division had problems with getting their deployment into reasonable shape. And they'd been badly chewed up by German mortar and multiple mortar fire. So 6th Airborne had a lot to do. If you look at in the middle of the map, you can see Breville. Now, Breville is just occupied like a bulge position. And when I did the research for the book, there was continued intelligence to suggest that the Germans were planning some sort of quite major counterattack around that point, between the 12th and the 15th of June. And Breville could have been a jump-off point. So Breville was like this boil in the line that Gale had to eliminate. Now, most of these battalions that you can see on the map were quite under strength due to scattering and losses. And so he had to put together a composite battle group of troops, because the only way he could do it, and he couldn't really afford to do it, he didn't have any reserves effectively in his budget. He put together a battle group of a squadron of the 13th, 18th Hussars, Sherman tanks, D Company, the 12th Devons, and what was left of 12th Parachute, the Yorkshire Parachute Battalion, 12th Para. And they came together to capture Breville. Unfortunately, the attack got off to a very bad start because the combined artillery of other divisions dropped short, and Brigadier Kindersley and Lord Lovat were injured. The commander, Kindersley, of the Air Landing Brigade, were injured as the attack began. But then the attack swept forward, and in tremendously tough fighting, they captured the village of Breville and eliminated the threat. And if you go to that photograph, that one there, that's the troops forming up in Omfreville before the attack on Breville. That gives you an idea of the situation. Well, that's obviously quite a calm-looking photograph. When they actually finished capturing Breville, the organ of the church was sort of jammed on. So as the battle ended, there was this hellish sort of steamy screaming coming from this organ, which must have made it awful. considering the dead and the wounded that were everywhere. Dudley Anderson, in his memoir about the Devon, the 12 Devons, he was wounded, and they set up an aid station, and they put him under the stairs. And unfortunately, they forgot about him, and he was lying there for some hours, not getting any sort of attention because it was dark and it was such a terrible mess. But with that victory, they kind of secured the line. And when I did my research, when I went to the German archive in Freiburg, I discovered information and communications which indicated that the German local commander had actually asked permission to withdraw back to the Dive line. So I think it's always a key. If you see the River Dive on the right, he's actually requested to pull back to the Dive line. And I think it's always a key moment if you stood any battle in any war. If one commander really wants to give up the ghost and pull back, I think it shows the victory of the other general, effectively. So that was a tremendous win, but that was a real crisis battle. And then after that, the airborne division settled down to hold the line while all the operations were going forward to the south.
And for how long then were they in the front line? How long before they were withdrawn to refit and reorganise?
They were on the line all the way through till the breakout and Operation Paddle, which is the push across towards the Seine River. They took part in that. Although they were obviously they had very limited mobility because they weren't motorised like the regular British infantry divisions, but they took part in that, and they were finally withdrawn at the end of August 1944. So they'd been there for the whole run. They were withdrawn back to the UK to be reformed and to be reinforced. And by October 44, they were back in some sort of shape.
So, Andy, what did they do for the rest of the war? What other operations were they involved in?
Okay, so they were withdrawn back to the UK to be reinforced and reformed at the end of August 1944. And they were in good enough cohesive shape in October 1944 for Simmons, the Canadian commander, to be pestering Montgomery to have them return to the Canadian side of operations because he'd valued them so highly in the Normandy campaign. And then they took part holding the line and fighting around villages during the Battle of the Bulge when some British troops went forward to support the Americans in that episode in December 1944. And then in March 1945, they took part in Operation Varsity, the big jump with 17th US Airborne Division, jumping the Rhine. And they did suffer quite serious casualties amongst the glider troops, mainly because of faulty intelligence regarding German concentrations of light anti-aircraft. And then later, they were prepared for a full-blown invasion of Malaya, and elements went out to the Far East, but obviously that didn't happen because the Americans used the nuclear bomb. And they finally ended up taking part in security operations in Palestine, where they were finally disbanded at the end of that in 1948.
A sad moment, no doubt.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said, I spoke to several of the veterans, and there was certainly an identity. They were all part of the airborne fraternity, Pegasus, the Maroon Machine, if you like. But I think they regarded themselves as special in the 6th Airborne Division.
So obviously, having studied this unit in such detail, what have been your conclusions, particularly, I guess, about Gale's command style and what made the division so effective?
It was, there's this diagram that I pulled together at the end, which gives you an idea really of this is how I kind of summarised. This sort of started out as like little notes of drawing, a bit of a fag packet sketch, as I kind of just sort of started identifying trends and the way he was working things. You could say, looking at this chart, it is stating the bleeding obvious, you could say, in terms of command and control and leadership. But I think Gale is an exemplar of the things that we talk about, these themes. He did undertake, if you look at the arrows, continuous training and constant communication. He was always talking to his troops. He's talking to his commanders. And then if you look at the 3 circles at the top, that gives you the themes of contemporary British sort of doctrine in terms of the development and creation of fighting power, conceptual, physical, and moral, and doctrine, lesson learning, training, equipment and manpower, cohesion and motivation. And he pursued all those things, all those understandings. Obviously, then, if you go down to the green boxes, there's the Army Air Corps input, identity, the volunteer spirit, standards, which were vigorously upheld by Boyd Browning, role-specific training, the toughening that took place at Hardwick Hall and the parachute training itself. And then also there's a strong element of organisational self-realisation, where they had distinctive headgear, distinctive uniform in the Denison smocks. They'd been through the shared experience of parachute and glider training, and this organisational self-realisation that they were the best, that they wanted to be the best, started to come through. I mean, that's very much the parachute regiment after World War II, I think, but it was starting in World War II. And then you've got the Gale effect, as I call it, which is energising communication, key authority within the airborne fraternity as an architect, but also as a traditional infantry soldier, with his experience that he emphasised in the way he dressed, of a World War I veteran. Simplicity, careful leader selection, and then moving forward, there was always a strong task focus. He tried to build in a redundancy of force, and also a strong use of the surprise element, which we haven't really talked about. But in the book, there's some fantastic research that a gentleman called Jim Storr did in 1994 in some MOD papers, where he talks about the surprise effect and a thing called attentional blink, where it's that moment where you take an enemy by surprise, and in that moment where they just sort of stood there, that's when you do your stuff. And so they use that surprise effect. Proximity of drop zones to objectives, that's obviously a very key element in the whole Normandy D-Day plan for 6th Airborne. Simplicity, clarity of task. We've got to blow this bridge up and then we're going to pull back to the perimeter line. That's the two jobs tonight, chaps. Mission-specific training, as I said, anti-armoured hedgehog training, how to deal with German mechanised forces, vigorous infantry training, how to fix bridges, and then closer command and control. The leaders were all present. As I said, 2 brigadiers were injured on the start line of the Battle of Breville. And then the output is initiative, cohesion, adaptation and improvisation, which leads to resilience and confidence, which makes their combat effectiveness.
No one can certainly deny they were an elite unit, and one we should remember very highly.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're, I don't know, I try to be objective about them, but when you're sat in a room with the veterans and they're talking about throwing stuffed moose heads out over the Rhine, you know, and they've got all these sort of stories, you can't help but admire them. And I think something worth bearing in mind, and it goes back to that Daryl Zanuck D-Day film, is because if you're of your generation and my generation, it all seems a foregone conclusion because we know they landed, we know they won. But if you were there at midday on the 5th of June, sat getting ready to get into a not particularly great RAF adapted plane to jump out over Normandy, you knew the German army was waiting for you, and they were dug in, and they've been digging in for 4 years. And I think it's once you start thinking along those lines, you think, well, I'm jumping in the dark. I've jumped out of a plane 8 times before, and when I'm floating down, the Germans are going to be shooting at me, and I don't know what I'm going to find when I get there. And then when you land and you discover that 7 out of your 10 mates that you expected to see aren't there, and there's just you and 2 of your mates, and then you get on and do the job anyway.
Thanks again to Andy. His book can be purchased from Helion Books, and I've put a link in the video description below. Subscribe for more fascinating and forgotten stories from British military history, and in the meantime, watch the video on screen now, as I think you'll really like it.